All right, good morning, everybody. We are back. It is another Tuesday, and you know what that means. It's time for breakfast with our man, Bill. Bill, how's it going this morning?
I'm doing good, Evan. Thank you so much. How are you today?
I'm doing well. I'm excited for today's topic, and I'm looking forward to learning about complex sales cycles and dealing with a bunch of different decision makers. Sometimes it's just not one guy making the decision, right? There can be multiple people throwing their hat in the ring.
Amen. I think so often as salespeople, we find ourselves in what I call complex selling environments or complex accounts. And as I was prepping for the show, I thought, which sales cycle isn't complex, right? And even if we're selling to one individual or we're selling to the CEO or what we perceive to be the chief decision maker, even in those cases, things can be very complex because we're dealing with multiple people. Many cases, we're dealing with how do we get on someone's calendar? How do we manage time? How do we manage everyone's sense of urgency? So I think these are situations we're all familiar with. And selling into complex accounts is very complex. So we're going to break this down today and over the next couple weeks, I think, to do it justice, because I don't think we can rifle through this in about 20 minutes. So today we'll lay the groundwork for what I consider to be a complex account, the things that we see come up inside of complex accounts when we're working with them and some of the decision makers, and then in the weeks ahead we'll dive into some of the underlying topics as well. Okay. So today, as we think about it, when we talk about complex accounts, just kind of laying out the playing field here, what makes them complex? Well, I think one of the greatest complexities we deal with is when we have multiple people involved, is dealing with multiple sets of information. Because what's important to one person isn't always necessarily what's important to the other. And as we sell into these accounts and these environments, we have people that might be in multiple aspects or multiple silos within the business. And as a result, they have competing interests. And as an example, if we're selling IT, well, our IT, the power of our IT might be or the power of our software, say, might be very powerful or important to the engineering group. But the financial implications of our software and how expensive we are might raise a whole nother set of concerns for procurement or finance. So we have to balance those needs. And just because we're having success inside of one area, and this is where we see people fail, is when we have success inside of one area and we have, this killer software that we think I'm just going to get the engineers behind and I'm going to get the business users behind, then I'm going to be okay with the IT department or the finance department. We'll just bully it through. And that might have worked at one point. I remember when I was a younger man selling software, and my VP of sales one day was telling me about, it's procurement. You just run through them and you have to make sure that they understand that your guy needs it and everything. Well, there were days where we could have done that, but I don't think those days exist anymore because you have professionals in procurement. You have people that are professionals in finance that are trained just as we're trained as salespeople to undermine value propositions that we set up. Now, I don't mean that negatively, but they're built to kind of break those down and make sure that the value that we're proclaiming our software delivers, it will actually deliver. And this applies to everything we're selling, whether it's commercial cleaning services, whether it's hoses and equipment for the oil and gas industry, whatever it is, it's not just software. We always will have various users that have competing interests. So, each of these individuals' different priorities is something that we need to balance. And we can't just assume that one person's priorities are greater or should hold more weight than another person's. That's something we see all the time, where somebody falls down because they assume that this individual I'm working with has more power or more influence than this individual. Going back to one of our principles, right? Going back to one of our foundational beliefs is sales is something we do for somebody, not to somebody. That means that we have to treat each individual in the process with dignity and respect. So as we treat each of them as individuals and we treat each of them as real people, then we start to realize that everybody's important. And just because this individual who's not the decision maker or not the business user uh, just because they feel something's important. I've experienced where when we can wrap that into the proposal and continue to keep that at the forefront, we build that coalition of supporters. We build that coalition of champions. Many times you'll hear selling systems talk about the need to build a champion or your white knight inside the organization. Absolutely, we want to build relationships as we go, but it doesn't always have to be one, right? I think the more and more we can engage people and the more we're able to get people behind our cause, the better off we'll be. So remember, we're not always just looking for a white knight, but how about we make everybody a white knight for us and win over as many as we can so that we're building good coalition through the account. And it's not always easy because when we're dealing with these individuals as we're trying to build champions or build these white knights inside the organization, we're dealing with multiple personalities. And if you're somebody who's outgoing, assertive, and bold, and if you've ever done DISC, if you're up on that D, high as a D or an I, and you have to work with procurement or you have to work with finance, oftentimes those people who are drawn to being in procurement or drawn to being in finance don't share your same level of urgency or your same level of emotion. So they may be much more fact-based. They may be and probably will be much more moderate, reserved, and thoughtful, and they don't have that same sense of extrovertedness as you. So how do you navigate towards them? How do you build relationship with them? It's an art, right? And it starts with caring about the other. It starts with recognizing that different is different, not different is wrong. So if we go into these accounts and we think that, finance wants all these details and they want to know how we're going to actually deliver the work and they want details in the statement of work and all that. Okay, if we go into that with a negative attitude, we're going to probably not treat them with the dignity they deserve to build a relationship with them. But just recognize different is different. They're motivated by different priorities. They're rewarded with different objectives, and they're built differently than we are. If they were built like us, they'd probably be in sales. We'd call them competition. Instead, we call them customers. So be mindful of the art of building relationship with each individual that's involved in this complex account and how we acknowledge and then how we address each of their needs versus just brushing them off as probably not being important. And remember that each individual there is going to also have a different sense of urgency. So just because our sense of urgency is that I need this signed by the end of the month, they may not share that same sense of urgency with us. And that's where we have to establish that sense of urgency and help them come along to understand why there's a value for them to potentially move this along by the end of the month. One thing we get in trouble with sense of urgency, one of the areas where we can get grossly misaligned with our customer or our client with a sense of urgency is when our quota becomes their problem, right? So remember, our quota is not their problem, and our needs for revenue are not always shared by them. So we can't impose that on them. We have to recognize they have a business they're running, they have things that are important to them, and we have to try to share with them a sense of urgency of value, and only when there's value for them can we do that. So that's our job as a sales professional, to try to align that value. Evan, I think you have something you would like to share with me.
Yeah, we got Matt Rogers watching along LinkedIn, not next to you this week, but watching
Matt,
along.
Did he sleep in?
He
Matt,
must have slept in, missed breakfast.
I hope you're enjoying your cup of coffee today, Matt.
Matt said, treating everyone with respect is imperative. It's what our sales process is built upon. Yet how many times do we guess influence wrong? Don't assume, confirm.
Yeah, one of Matt's favorite quotes about the all of sales, in particular understanding decision processes, is always confirm, never assume. And too often we assume we have the decision maker, we know what's important to them, or we know that we have the right alignment with their needs. And then we end up finding out at the end that someone else was better positioned, or someone else had something that allowed them to win that wasn't even related, to the solution, right? It was just that they either had a better supports team or better service terms, or they were more closely located, so there was a perception that they could deliver better. We have to eliminate those perceptions and those assumptions through the process. Anyone want to guess how we do that? That's right. By asking great questions, by extending these great invitations to conversation that flush out all the assumptions and allow us to focus on what we can actually confirm and know to be true. So, Matt, thanks for that point. It's always good to have you, even if it's remote. So remember, our job is once we flush those assumptions out and we're able to confirm what's important, whether it's around solution needs, and that's an important point. Solution needs, not so much the solution wants. Because if we start hearing things that we don't confirm in the process, we confuse needs and wants, and they're not the same. Very simply put, needs are something that people are willing to pay for. Wants are nice to haves. So very rarely will somebody go and find additional budget for you because of wants. People will always find budget for needs, right? And when somebody's not willing to pay for something, it's an easy way to understand if that was a need or a want. But remember, we don't want to always react and jump to what we think are wants. We need to confirm that it's actually a need, and not focus so much on the wants. Wants are great if we can fit them into the solution, but needs need to be our focus. So again, our job in complex accounts, manage the various personalities, manage to understand the process, the decision process, manage to understand needs versus wants, and then start to establish some type of timeline. And what we'd like to, the way we like to think about that is, in these complex accounts, it's critical to think about sales as project management, right? Every one of us has been involved in some type of project, whether it's been an IT deployment internally at our company, whether it's, raking the leaves as a family, whatever it is, there's a project that we've all been involved with. And we understand what goes into project management. So what are some of those key steps of project management? Well, we have multiple people. And in the case of managing complex accounts, excuse me, it's us, it's our contact on the other side who might be the point person that we're selling to. It could also be the individuals inside that account that are influencers, yet not really the business user or the product user. So these are all the people involved inside of the project, if you will. And then what else happens in project management? Well, we define who's going to do what, right? So if you've ever been part of an IT release, which I used to be in the world of software, so excuse my software references, but in software, you have to define what's needed, right? So you work with the business user, or the business case manager, and you define their needs and their scope of work. And then you go back and people program that. And then we have to test it. And then so there's all these layers that have to happen for us to hit a release date. And for that to happen, we put these flags in the ground, these stakes in the ground as we move along that say, here's who's going to do what, when they're going to do it by, and why that's important. And it's the same in selling into complex accounts. We like to believe, or we like to think of sales as project management. So who's involved and what do we need to do? Because it's not a straight line, right? It is not a straight line from hello to thank you. We need to navigate that with great art, but most importantly, following the process, because the process is what gets us there as quickly as possible. So think about who's involved. Think about what do we need to do and why that's important. So what do I owe you? What do you need to do internally? Who do you need to get information from? How's that going to play for them, right? So we balance all these activities that need to happen. First thing is we need to define them. And I can tell you, if you have a sales account, if you have an account where somebody's doing something for you, where they have a task and they're completing it, whether that's gathering data, whether that's getting intel on how long they think this is going to take, whatever it is, information about the current incumbent or the competition. Whenever somebody's getting you information back, they're engaged in the process. If every task on our project management list is, I'm going to send you this and I'm going to do that, we don't have an engaged prospect. So we need to be honest with ourselves. Is there something we're missing, right? Or are we afraid to ask? Or do we just have somebody that's not that into us? And we have to be honest with ourselves. So define those tasks. And then one of the most important things we can do is define when they're going to occur. So I'm going to get you this by Friday. You're going to get me this by next Monday. We're going to have this exchange of information. And the way to tie urgency into an account where urgency might not exist is to look out into the future. And Av, can you say something witty while I take a sip of coffee?
Yes, I can. While you're clearing your throat, I'll give you a little bit of a break. I was actually going to get you water, potentially. But I guess since it's breakfast with Bill, you got to go for coffee.
Yeah.
Just a quick update on the technical side. Our LinkedIn comments aren't showing on the chat. Big shout out to Restream.io. I guess the connection with LinkedIn's broken, but I am able to get them on my phone. I'm watching along with everyone at home. So if you have a comment, feel free to leave it on LinkedIn, and I will be able to read it out loud for us here.
Great. Thanks for covering for me there so I can get some coffee in me. And do you remember where I was with that?
Absolutely.
Great. Establishing a sense of urgency. So when we look out into the future and we think about when do we want to implement this by? So what's our go live date? When do we want to either transition to our firm versus the incumbent? Do you have a contract that's expiring? Whenever we can look out and find a meaningful date of value, we start to work backwards. And, as we come up on the end of the year, there's going to be a lot of people that we might engage with that will say, yeah, let's go live January 1st. Let's start this for January 1st. So great. January 1st is a wonderful date. The great news for us as salespeople is it's approaching quickly. So if we want to get started January 1st, here's what needs to happen, right? And we just work into a project management plan with somebody that says, okay, so we want to go live January 1st. Well, we know nothing's going to happen between Christmas and New Year, so that means we really want to have this done by, and I'd look to the Friday before Christmas or maybe the Wednesday before Christmas. So look at that Wednesday before Christmas break and say, we want to have everything in place by blank. And let's just say that date's the 18th. So we want to have everything done by the 18th of December. That means for us to get there, your legal team or whatever is going to have to review documents by when? When do you think we're going to have to get them to them? By Thanksgiving? So they have a couple weeks of back and forth? Does that seem fair? And we throw it to them. Because if they come back and are like, no, we don't have legal, I can do that in one day, then we don't want to set artificial timelines. But verify that and say, really? You're going to be able to sign off on this and legal's not going to need to take a look at it? If so, that's great. I just know in our experience that usually has to travel through, this department. But set that up, come and just continually work backwards. Because you say, okay, if we need to have a statement of work or we need to have some docs in for legal to review by Thanksgiving, then that means we need to have everything, vetted and tested and doing all this by the week before that, which means to hit that date, we have to start now, right? So you start working backwards and it creates that sense of urgency because the last thing we want to do is have someone say, let's get started January 1st. And we're like, wonderful. What should we do next? And they're like, call me that first or second week in November. And we start the process. And there's no worse feeling than being up against the end of our measuring period, right? Is if that's monthly or quarterly or annually, with something that we know we could have won and closed that's slipping because of our lack of attentiveness to the process. So think of sales as project management, set that end date down the road and work backward. And we use each of these weeks or couple weeks to set up the tasks, set up the flags of the things we need to accomplish so that we could hit our goal at the end. All right, so that's the first step, acknowledging that things are complex. The second step, think about what our project management plan is going to look like and how we attack this sales cycle as we would a normal project management plan. Things still left for us to do are establishing value across the organization, across the multiple disciplines, understanding their buying process or their decision process, and then how we start to speak the language of the stakeholder when they're in front of us. So those are topics we'll dive into in the weeks ahead. But between now and next week, let's think about that. Let's think about how do we, first of all, acknowledge and define the personalities that are involved. How do we start thinking about all that complexity that exists across the organization, the multi-level selling that needs to take place? And how do we start to define our sales process as more of a project management process? And next week, we'll dive into a little more detail of the rest of this process. Until then, you might notice I'm not wearing pink today, as we promised we would be during October. I'm actually wearing a black tie. Unfortunately, I'm attending a funeral today for the spouse of one of my dear friends, Dave Barone. So between now and next week, please keep the Barone family in your prayers. I hope you guys are well, and God bless. We'll see you next Tuesday.